Ani, and welcome. Thank you for listening to my presentation today. My name is Rachel, and I will be discussing the colonial history of victimization of Indigenous women in Canada. Colonialism created structures that disproportionately harmed Indigenous women, and these impacts continue today. Viewer discretion is advised, as this presentation will be discussing themes of sexual assault and violence. We will begin by defining colonial victimization, then examine key policies and forms of violence, explore contemporary impacts, and conclude with recommendations to address these harms. So, what is colonial violence? It can be understood through three different definitions: colonialism, gendered colonialism, and structural violence. Colonialism is not just a historical event, as Moncolin explains in The Colonial Problem. It is an ongoing system of domination. The Canadian state imposed political, legal, and social control over Indigenous people, privileging settler interests while undermining Indigenous sovereignty, culture, land, and safety. Colonialism is also gendered. Indigenous women were specifically targeted because colonial authorities sought to dismantle matriarchal or women centered social systems. This included the imposition of European patriarchal norms, legal disenfranchisement through the Indian Act, and narratives that hypersexualized and devalued Indigenous women. Moncolin uses the concept of structural violence to describe how harm is produced by social, legal, political, and economic structures. Violence is structural when institutions create conditions of poverty, insecurity, or exposure to abuse. For example, policing, child welfare, and laws that remove women from their communities produce long term vulnerability. By replacing Indigenous governance and legal systems with colonial structures, women were removed from positions of authority, decision making, and cultural protection. These structural and gender dynamics laid the foundation for the patterns of victimization we see historically and today. I will now be examining the key colonial policies in Canada that target Indigenous women, which includes the Indian Act, residential schools, and child removal policies such as the 60s Scoop. The Indian Act imposed European patriarchal governance, stripping women of legal status if they married non status men, removing them from their communities, and limiting access to land, housing, and social support. Residential schools exposed Indigenous girls to high levels of physical and sexual abuse, disrupted families, and normalized violence, producing intergenerational trauma that persists today. The 60s Scoop continued this displacement by removing children from Indigenous families, severing cultural and community ties, and placing them into unsafe environments. Broader colonial controls like the pass system and forced relocations restricted movement and disrupted social networks, increasing isolation and vulnerability. These policies created systemic long term vulnerability for Indigenous women. The impacts of colonialism perpetuated stereotypes and narratives of Indigenous women, which has made them susceptible to victimization and harm. In The Colonial Problem, Moncolin explains that colonial victimization operates through racialized and gendered narratives that shaped how Indigenous women were perceived. One of the most harmful labels is the squaw stereotype, which portrayed Indigenous women as sexually available, morally inferior, and deviant. These stereotypes dehumanize women and frame them as responsible for the violence committed against them, making them seem less worthy of protection or justice. Indigenous women were also hypersexualized, which normalized violence and led authorities to dismiss or ignore reports of abuse. This contributed to a broader devaluation of their lives, reflected today in the high rates of sexual assault, with over 43% of Indigenous women having experienced sexual assault since age 15, according to Statistics Canada. Colonial narratives treated Indigenous women as disposable, influencing policing and justice responses. Failures to investigate missing persons, inadequate police action, and lack of accountability were predictable outcomes of a system that viewed Indigenous women as inherently violable. Cases like the Highway of Tears and Robert Picton show how these dynamics played out historically and continue to shape systemic neglect today. Unfortunately, there is a long history of violence against Indigenous women, as it is widespread and systemic. Statistics Canada reports that more than 6 in 10 Indigenous women have experienced physical or sexual assault in their lifetime. Colin emphasizes that this violence is not new and it follows historical patterns from colonialism, including state and police violence, sexual exploitation, disappearances, and disproportionately high homicide rates. Indigenous women are killed at rates over 6 times higher than non Indigenous women, showing how colonial neglect has deadly consequences. During early colonial contact and the fur trade, women were frequently sexually exploited by settlers, with stereotypes framing them as sexually available and disposable. As colonial institutions developed, violence increasingly occurred through state systems. Police and courts often ignored abuse, criminalized Indigenous women, or allowed perpetrators to act with impunity. These patterns continue today. Indigenous women face disproportionately high rates of disappearance and homicide, and cases are often under investigated. National data, including the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, confirm that colonial systems have consistently failed to protect Indigenous women. Moncolin makes clear that this violence is structural, not accidental, and that colonialism created conditions that made Indigenous women vulnerable while denying them justice and protection. Now, I want to present the case of Helen Betty Osborne, which powerfully illustrates how colonial systems create vulnerability for Indigenous women and fail to protect them. On November 13, 1971, 19-year-old Helen was abducted, raped, and murdered in the Pass, Manitoba. The RCMP identified 4 young white men as the perpetrators, but took 16 years for a conviction. Dwayne Johnston received life imprisonment. James Houghton was acquitted, Lee Colgan received immunity for testifying, and Norman Manger was never charged. As Bateman explains, this case demonstrates colonial patterns of victimization, including police neglect and systemic racism. Despite witnesses and evidence, the investigation was slow and biased, shaped by Helen's identity as an Indigenous woman. The perpetrators even stated they were looking for an Indian girl with whom to drink and have sex with, reflecting stereotypes of Indigenous women as sexually available, disposable, and less deserving of protection. Helen was a student with aspirations to become a teacher, directly challenging stereotypes that diminish Indigenous women's lives. Her murder was shaped by broader colonial narratives that hypersexualized and devalued Indigenous women. These failures cannot be separated from the colonial context. Policies that displaced Indigenous families, limited economic opportunities, and normalized racial segregation created social vulnerability. Witness testimony was ignored, evidence was mishandled, and racialized assumptions did influence decisions, revealing how systemic racism delayed justice. Bateman argued that Helen's case is not isolated, it reflects broader systemic failures rooted in colonialism. Helen's story remains a key example of the patterns later documented in national inquiries into violence against Indigenous women. The impacts of colonialism are not just historical. They continue to shape Indigenous women's lives today, producing intergenerational trauma, socioeconomic marginalization, and ongoing exposure to violence. Intergenerational trauma arises from systems like the Indian Act, residential schools, and child removal policies. Trauma affects survivors and is passed down, shaping mental health, relationships, and vulnerability to victimization. Colonial policies also created economic marginalization. Restrictions on land, employment, and legal status led to persistent poverty and housing insecurity, which increased exposure to unsafe environments and violence. Indigenous women also face overpolicing and underprotection. Police responses are frequently delayed, dismissive, or inadequate, reflecting ongoing colonial control rather than safety. These conditions are evident in the MMIWG crisis, which identifies colonialism, systemic racism, and institutional neglect as root causes of disproportionate violence and deaths. Moncolin shows that colonialism in Canada created systemic vulnerability by embedding equality into law, governance, and social institutions. Policies like the Indian Act, residential schools, and child removal systems specifically targeted Indigenous women, increasing the risk of harm and reduced protection. Colonial stereotypes reinforce neglect by shaping policing, court decisions, media coverage, and public response to disappearances and deaths. This harm is produced across systems. Law, policing, education, child welfare, and media all work together to reproduce colonial violence. Indigenous women are both highly visible to control and invisible when they need justice. Colonial violence is gendered and intersectional. Indigenous women face harm because of their Indigenous identity, but also because colonialism operates through patriarchy, racism, and class inequality. This increases risks of poverty, housing insecurity, criminalization, and exposure to violence. Ultimately, today's violence is structural, not accidental. Both Montcallan and the MMIWG inquiry emphasize that colonialism created the conditions for this harm, which continue today. Without addressing these systems, violence will continue to be treated as isolated incidents rather than a predictable outcome of colonial structures. To address ongoing violence against Indigenous women, responses must tackle colonial roots. The first recommendation is to implement the MMIWG calls for justice. These identify colonialism as the root cause of violence and demand systemic change. The second recommendation is to invest in Indigenous led safety and justice initiatives. Supporting Indigenous governance and community programs recognizes Indigenous women as leaders and knowledge holders in addressing violence. Tools like Safe Passage provide trauma informed support for women, girls, and gender diverse people. The third recommendation is to decolonize policing and justice systems. This means confronting systemic racism, ending over policing and underprotection, and ensuring accountability for failures to investigate violence. The fourth recommendation is to increase funding for shelters, housing, and mental health supports. Colonial policies created economic inequality and housing insecurity, which heightens vulnerability. Addressing these material conditions is essential for prevention. And lastly, the final recommendation is to implement anti racism and colonial history training for law enforcement, social workers, healthcare professionals, and educators so that they understand the ongoing impacts of colonial narratives to prevent harm rather than reproduce it. To conclude, this presentation has shown that the violence against Indigenous women is rooted in colonial structures, not individual actions. Colonial policies like the Indian Act, residential schools, and child removal systems removed Indigenous women from positions of safety, authority, and protection. These policies created systemic vulnerability, reinforced by stereotypes that devalued and hypersexualized Indigenous women, enabling state neglect and normalizing violence. Cases like Helen Betty Osborne, along with the broader MMIWG crisis, demonstrate that these patterns persist today. This violence is structural and gendered, not random. Understanding this history is essential for meaningful prevention and justice. Addressing it requires systemic change, centering Indigenous voices, implementing the MMIWG calls for justice, and reforming policing, justice, and social supports.